Now, the name of Unit 7 is Global Conflict, so it stands to reason that World War I and World War II would certainly factor into it. So we're going to take a similar approach to World War II as we did with World War I, or what was called the Great War. We start with one video by looking at what led to it, and then we look at how it was waged and maybe some of the after effects. All right, so World War II, and the start of it really shouldn't be much of a surprise, given that the 30s really was a gradual buildup. So the Japanese invaded Chinese-held Manchuria in 1931, and this was done in defiance of the League of Nations. And they knew that the Chinese were vulnerable because the nationalists were engaged in a civil war with the communists. In 1937, they invaded the Chinese coast, leading to a ceasefire between the warring Chinese factions, who, they never really coordinated their efforts or combined their forces throughout the length of the war. Due to the nature of their extreme nationalism, the Japanese believed themselves to be racially superior, and they killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in China. This new version of total war was to include the murder and degradation of women and children. And it was an absolutely horrendous experience. So that explains Japanese actions. The Italians set about to fulfill Mussolini's promise to rebuild the greatness of Rome and create an Italian colonial empire. So partially in retaliation for the Battle of Adwa in the mid-1890s, the Italians overwhelmed Ethiopian forces with modern rifles and tanks, and they even dropped poisonous gases on Ethiopian villagers. The Ethiopian emperor warned the League of Nations that if effective action was not taken, no small nation would ever be safe. The League placed economic sanctions on Italy, but they really did little good since they already had access to resources like Libyan oil and German assistance. The thing that really can be considered the tune-up to World War II is the Spanish Civil War of the late 1930s. It's a testing ground for the strategies we'll see play out. Now, Spain is in the midst of a massive shift in political ideology, where the monarch had stepped down and the freely elected government was turning towards socialism as a method of dealing with the Great Depression. Many generals in the military had been sent to what remained of the Spanish Empire to isolate them. Francisco Franco was sent to the Azores, but nonetheless was able to muster enough support to seize power by force. There were massive atrocities that were committed on both sides. So the socialist forces specifically targeted Roman Catholic clergy, while mass graves containing tens of thousands of victims of Franco's forces are actually still being exhumed today. The Germans and Italians used the war as an opportunity to provide their soldiers with combat experience and to utilize upgraded tanks and an air force in battle. The air force for the Germans had been banned as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So this is going to be tested out. The Battle of Guernica is in Basque Country in Spain. And Guernica is the center of Republican resistance and really the center of Basque culture. In April 1937, the city was bombarded for 2 solid hours by the Luftwaffe, which again, they're not allowed to exist, but they do, leading to anywhere between 400 to 800 dead. The painter Pablo Picasso heard about it, and 2 weeks later, he painted what you see on your screen. This not only symbolizes what happened in Guernica, but it becomes a symbol for the horrors of war in the modern era. Now, in the end, the Soviet forces are going to pull out because they're facing the threat of the Nazis in Germany. And of course, when many people think of World War II, they think of the Nazis. The Germans are heightening their aggression in Europe, and the Western powers are going to stand by and do nothing. The Germans seized the Rhineland in 1936, and the Rhineland is an area bordering France, and this is a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. There was no response from the League of Nations. None. So Hitler believed it was open season. Now, part of Germany's expansion was due to Hitler's belief that the German people needed Lebensraum, or living space to pursue their racial destiny. And the Germans scattered in the east. They needed to be reunited with their homeland. In his complete vision, Hitler hoped that the Jews would be cleared from the eastern spaces, while the Slavic peoples would remain to provide slave labor. Some Westerners unfortunately sympathized with the anti-Semitism and anti-communist positions of Hitler, and most Western leaders felt that Hitler could indeed be contained. Now, the Germans followed up their claims to the Rhineland with their annexation of the Sudetenland, which is a region of Czechoslovakia where he claimed that minority Germans were being discriminated against. Winston Churchill, who was a member of British Parliament, tried to propose an Anglo-French initiative to head off Hitler, but he was shot down by a British public who were not only they weren't eager necessarily to become engaged in another war. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously flew to Munich in 1937, and he conceded the Sudetenland to the Germans, following through on a policy of appeasement. He felt that if minor concessions were made to Hitler, then a major war could be prevented, and he referred to it as peace in our time. The next year, Hitler's forces marched into Austria unopposed. So this kind of gives you an idea of what's happening. We have the Rhineland. We have the Sudetenland. They marched into Austria. Czechoslovakia isn't going to be safe. The Maginot Line was a fortification that was kind of left over from World War I. So whenever you hear about the French fortifying the Maginot Line, that's simply what it refers to. And here we got Italy going into Albania, even leading into the war. Stalin's really the only leader who understood and appreciated the threat that Hitler posed. The fact that the Western powers stayed out of conflict in Ethiopia, Spain, and Czechoslovakia really was concerning to him. He feared that if he did not have any Western allies, his Red Army would not be able to withstand the onslaught of a full-scale German invasion. Part of this was his own doing, because he killed about half the officers in his army during the Great Purges. But he nevertheless was the only leader who took the threat of Hitler seriously. Neither leader was fond of one another, but the two signed a non-aggression pact in summer 1939, and they secretly divided Poland. Really, Hitler was delaying his attack on Russia, whereas Stalin was using his borrowed time to prepare his country for war. The common date given for the start of World War II is the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. France and Great Britain declared war, but did nothing militarily to immediately back it up. U.S. public opinion was decidedly against another war. So here we are, 20 years later, the world at war once again.